Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome to the Yale Center for British Art at Home Artists in Conversation series. I'm Martina Droth. I'm the Deputy Director and the Chief Curator of the Center. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Yinka Shonibare CBE RA to our program today. Welcome, Yinka.
Yes, hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so thrilled. I'm so excited for this conversation. Before I get started, I have a few notes for our audience. Please note that this program is being recorded and that your camera and your microphones are off and they'll remain off throughout the program. But I would like to invite you to ask questions. You can use the Q&A function that you'll find on your Zoom navigation bar. Just write your questions as they occur to you. As Yinka and I are talking, you don't have to save them to the end. And we'll make sure we build in some time at the end to get to them. I now want to read our land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pugusset, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. Yinka Shonibare CBE RA was born in London in the UK. He has also spent time and continues to spend time in Lagos, Nigeria. And this dual experience of two places, two cultures is very much interwoven into his work, as we shall see. Within his interdisciplinary practice, working across painting, sculpture, film, photography, clothing, and quilts, the incorporation of brightly colored Dutch wax fabrics has become a recognizable signature in his work. And what's important to know about the fabrics is that they became associated with Africa, but originated in Holland and were inspired by traditional Indonesian batik, making the fabrics the product of global trade and speaking to the cultural hybridity that Yinka has made central to his work. Yinka studied at the Byam Shaw School of Art, which is now Central St. Martin's, and completed his MFA at Goldsmiths in 1991. In 2002, he was commissioned to make a major work for Documenta 11, followed by his nomination for the Turner Prize in 2004, his inclusion at the Venice Biennale in 2007, and his commission for Trafalgar Square's fourth plinth in 2010, and we will talk about that a little later. And he has continued to exhibit widely and internationally since then. The last time I had the pleasure of introducing Yinka was in 2016 here at Yale, and in person, the days of in-person events. We had an exhibition of Yinka's work at the Yale Center for British Art, and he did a public conversation with Kobina Mercer, our colleague in History of Art and African American Studies here at Yale. At that time, in 2016, Yinka was an MBE. Now he is Yinka Shonibare CBE RA, and he is curating the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition for this year. And lastly, I want to mention that he is also an art icon, and I mean that in the fullness of the double meaning of that phrase, because he was awarded the Whitechapel Gallery Art Icon Award in March of 2021. So I congratulate you, Yinka, on this and your many honors. And it is, of course, such an honor to have you here with us for this talk.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And also thank you for what you said at the beginning about indigenous peoples of America. I think every conversation in America should begin with that. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for saying so, Yinka. Appreciate that. I'm going to dive right in and start with our first slide. Here we are. And I thought I'd start with a work that's very close to home for us here at Yale, because this is in our collection and it really represents a major and very important acquisition in recent years for the center. And in fact, it was made for us. So this work was commissioned for an exhibition that we held at the center in 2017, Enlightened Princesses, Caroline, Augusta, Charlotte, and the Shaping of the Modern World. And it looked at the role that women played in the history of the monarchy. And I wondered, Yinka, if you would talk a little bit about your thinking behind this work and what it was about this commission that interested you in taking it on.
When I was commissioned to do this work, I did a bit of research and I realized that Mrs. Pinkney was somebody who she'd learned the indigo trade from her enslaved workers. And she then created a big business out of that. She also had an indigo dress. And then she visited, I think it was the turn of the century, 19th century, I think. And she had visited a princess in England.
Yeah.
And she brought gifts of birds with her. And also the dress that she was wearing was quite well documented. But then I thought she created this fantastic business from the skills that she picked up from Africans. And I somehow wanted to acknowledge the event of visiting the princess in England, but also acknowledging the enslaved people who actually worked for her. And so I created a globe, and she was placed on that globe, a globe that was dated at the time of the visit. And then, of course, it's titled Mrs. Pinkney and the Emancipated Birds of South Carolina. Now, the emancipated birds, that's a metaphor for caging the enslaved peoples who worked for her. And so it's a metaphor for their freedom and also a way to acknowledge the way that they helped her become the lady that she became.
Yeah, acknowledging the role they played. Yeah.
And so the cage is a symbol of their emancipation. And they are not inside the cage, they are outside of the cage.
Just going to show our audience a beautiful detailed view of the work that shows the kind of elaborate fabrication. I'm interested in what you said about the bird cage. You know, some of your earlier works, we see headless figures, and in some of your other works, we see globes, so that the head seems to be an important locus for sort of amplifying the theme of the work.
Yes, I mean, I've found that to be a useful device in carrying whatever messages I want to put across in the sculpture. But also, there are lots of historical references. So in my sculpture, I don't really, in the beginning, when the sculptures didn't have heads, that was a reference to the French Revolution and the way that the aristocracy in France were beheaded with the guillotine because of their greed, and then happened to poorer people as a result of that greed. And so, yes, I have used the device of the head also as a way not to specifically put in a particular race on those figures. So then they become, if you like, humanity, but then they express the follies of humanity itself. So that's why I do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Yinka. Let me move on to another work. This, incidentally, also in our collection, and is based on the painting, as you can see from the title, The Death of Chatterton by Henry Wallace. The Tate has the big painting. We have the small oil study for it. And we've seen you in some of your other works turn paintings into sculpture installations with mannequins. And here you've turned a painting into a tableau vivant and made it into a photograph. I wondered what led you to these elaborate recreations of historical artworks.
See, somewhere around the 80s and 90s, the talk was of postmodernism. And the idea there was to revisit history rather than just focusing on artworks based on form or formal innovations. So it was about sort of looking back at history, but then deconstructing those canons. And so the painting by Henry Wallace is a well-known painting. It's part of the canon, as it were. Mm. And so my idea then is to look into those canonical pictures and then make some kind of interruption or intervention. And so that's what I've done here.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's another work in that sort of making that kind of an interruption into the canon based on a famous print by Goya. Incidentally, we have an impression of it at the Yale Art Gallery. And I was interested in how you made this as a series with variations, and each one has a unique title. And here you can see two of them. We have Asia and Africa, and you've also made versions depicting Australia, Europe, and America. What led you to this series where you're effectively representing the continents with different individuals in the pictures.
Okay, so this is a series from originally Goya did a series, I think it was called Los Caprichos, and it was about war in Spain at the time. And he was also thinking about the irrational impulses of humans generally. And so he produced a set of prints called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. And so at the time, I was contemplating the wars that we had at the time. There was war in Iraq, there was war in Afghanistan, and then unrest in parts of Nigeria too. And I was just thinking about how that irrational impulse is not continent specific. It's something that humanity does. And so I created this series looking at the different continents and each picture representing a different continent. So that's what this series is about.
Oh, thank you. That's so interesting. I didn't realize that. I wanted to just show our audience this picture that shows, this also gives a sense of scale. You know, these are really monumental works and you can see the series together here. I want to now look at something very different, move on to your public sculpture. And for those of you who are in New Haven, you remember that we showed this as part of our exhibition of Yinka's work in 2016. So this is the model for your first public sculpture that was made for this site. If you could just talk a little bit about your thinking behind this and how you wanted to respond to this space, Trafalgar Square in London.
And so this is called Trafalgar Square because of the Battle of Trafalgar that happened in Spain, and the battle was between Napoleon and Nelson. And Nelson being the captain of HMS Victory, which is the ship that we're looking at now. And when Britain won that war against Napoleon, Britain was then able to travel the seas more freely. That also helped to foster the expansion of the British Empire. And so I wanted to actually do something with that boat. And I installed the sails of, batik, African textile. So I changed the sails of HMS Victory. And then I put it into a bottle. So on the one hand, it looks like this sort of harmless, magical object.
Yes.
But then on the other, there are very complex histories as a result of the British victory at Trafalgar. And it was important to me then that a work would speak to its context. And so that's why I made Nelson's Ship in a Bottle.
Yeah, and I will, for those audience members who may not know, this sort of so-called fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square is an empty plinth that was made for statues and now is used for these changing contemporary commissions. And I think this was the first time that one of those commissions, the one that you made, Yinka, really engaged with that history of the square. And it was very powerful. And also, I was so struck by how the materials that you used just fly in the face of everything we associate with public sculpture. So, it's sort of glass suggests fragility and fabrics. I just wondered, what your thinking was in pushing against the boundaries maybe of the kinds of objects we often see in our public spaces.
Yes, I mean, I like to push boundaries of form as well as content in my work. So obviously I wasn't going to just put a statue there, and I wasn't going to make sculpture in the way that people are used to sculpture being made, because that's not very interesting to me. And yes, so pushing the boundaries of what can be defined as sculpture is also very much something I'm passionate about, because I want to make, when I make a work of art, I want to make a new contribution to the conversation. I don't want to kind of just be like lemmings and just follow. I'm not sort of interested in simply just blindly following. I want to bring something to the table. So, that's why I try to push the boundaries in my work.
Absolutely. And I think you certainly have pushed the boundaries for public sculpture. I just want to show this image. So the Trafalgar Square Commission was temporary, but now it's installed on a permanent basis outside the National Maritime Museum. And I wondered, Yinka, how this came about and how you feel about this as a new permanent site for this work.
Well, you see, the Maritime Museum is very interesting because Maritime Museum, actually, they have the largest collection of Nelson memorabilia, from his jacket to various Nelson bits and pieces. And so they'd seen that installation in Trafalgar Square, and they simply approached me to ask if what would happen to the piece afterwards and could they acquire it. And of course, I quickly said yes. Not only was it going to make me richer, which was not a bad thing, but also it was good to have the work there permanently. On a more serious note. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't think of another site that would be so fitting with what you're doing here in relation to their collection. So you mentioned about pushing against the boundaries of public sculpture, and I wanted to show some of your more recent works, these pieces that you call wind sculptures. And could you tell us a little bit about when did you start making these works and how did you arrive at this concept of fabric in the wind?
So after doing Nelson's Ship in a Bottle, and I was working on the sails on that, I started to really think about the symbolism of migration, of wind blowing the sails, and the wind kind of driving the boats that many migrants have to use, navigate. And then, the kind of cross-Atlantic slave trade, the movements of people, unfortunately, the drowning of Africans trying to cross the sea. And then I wanted to do a kind of a symbolic sculpture. And I also wanted to think about the form of sculpture itself. I usually kind of heavy materials, volume. I decided to, yes, this is made out of painted fiberglass, but it's a heavy material made to look weightless. And also the concept, the possibility of actually capturing wind through sculpture, I also found quite exciting. And so that's how I made this. And also putting it on the ground with people at the same level as the human experience, as opposed to elevating it above eye level, given and then the sculpture literally towering over people and looking down on them. So this is to bring it down to earth where people are. And that's why I've made this work.
Absolutely. It's so interesting how you've just described that. It makes me think that we could read these as a celebration of migration and immigration. So sometimes you've installed them on a temporary basis, but this is a permanent installation here in London in Howick Place. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about how the debate around public statues, I mean, you've already just hinted at it, lowering the statue to the ground instead of raising it on a plinth. But how have the recent debates about the role of public sculpture and monuments in our public spaces inflected your own thinking about the kinds of public sculpture you want to make in these kinds of spaces?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you know about the controversy that's been going on around sculptures of people traffickers, really, I would call them, of slave owners, and how Edward Colston in England was pulled down. I'm sure you've seen all of those. And I think that we need to rethink this whole public sculpture issue, and we need to be sensitive to our current populations, because the legacy of slavery is everywhere. And the people who championed that slavery, the people traffickers of the olden days, we should call them what they are, really. We don't want to glorify people traffickers. Our morals have changed, so we shouldn't do that. And I think that where those sculptures can be taken down, my view is very clear on this. I don't want to erase history, but I think that those sculptures can be contextualized. They can either have texts written next to them. If they can't be taken down, if the local population don't want them taken down, then we should understand what those people were really about. And where it's possible to take them down, then put them into museums and then explain what the sculptures were about. Edward Colson that's gone up in a museum in the UK, but it's actually on its side because the leg is broken, I think. I actually like the idea of displaying them on their side, not upright. That would be brilliant if they could do that. That would be my thinking about those sculptures.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Edward Colson on his side, no longer standing above us. I wanted to just show this last example of one of your public sculptures. And this is in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, a place I know very well because I lived nearby when I worked at the Henry Moore Institute. And I do think of Henry Moore when I think of the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. So I also think it's interesting that some of those kinds of more, what we would now call it, traditional sculptor like Henry Moore, that your work seems to be signaling towards a shift of new kinds of possibilities for public spaces and how artists are contributing to match the needs of our time.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, if you look at a lot of historical public sculpture, it's usually the male gaze on women's bodies. And if it's not the male gaze on women's bodies, it's about the power of men over everybody. Those kinds of debates in our society, we've gone through them, we keep going through them. And we need a change, we need a bit of a change. We need to remake the world in our own image. And no doubt the next generation will make the world in their own image, and so on and so on. So why should anything be permanent? These things can evolve as the populations change and evolve. I don't believe that there should be permanence for anything, really.
Yeah, it's a great point. So public sculpture is often very much associated with permanence, even though actually there is a lot of change. Things get taken down and destroyed.
Yes.
Speaking of the past, I wanted to show this series of works, which I just find so fascinating. I think most people will see that these sculptures are based on antiquities, which are often thought of as white, not only because they either exist in white marble, they also exist in white plaster and have been reproduced for academies, art schools. So we're very familiar to seeing these as white marble or plaster statues. What was your thinking behind these works and wanting to paint them in your sort of iconic fabric patterns?
Well, I mean, when I was doing some research on these sculptures, well, first of all, I realized that the sculptures were not white when they were made initially. There was an art historian called Johann Winkelmann who suggested then that the white of the sculptures symbolized the superiority of the white race over others. And I decided to reclaim those sculptures. And also, the time I was thinking about this work, the alt-right was expanding and getting bigger. And they were using classical sculptures as a way to represent themselves and their ideas. And I decided to look at classical sculpture more closely and to literally paint them, deconstruct them. And so that's what happened here.
They're so stunning to look at. I just wanted to show this detailed slide so people can see how. Are these also made of fiberglass, Yinka?
Yes, they're fiberglass, yeah, and painted.
And then painted.
Yeah.
And here's another example. All of them very famous statues that have probably been endlessly reproduced in plaster in academies. I was thinking of the Royal Academy, Yinka, where you're curating a show, and how the hallways of the art school are still contain those plaster casts.
Yes, because artists, used to draw from them.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about the work you've just recently made, and that's currently on exhibition at Stephen Friedman Gallery in London. This is an installation view from that show. I'm really sad not to be in London to see it. So here you're again taking existing classical sculptures and remaking them. And you've talked about doing Picasso in reverse here. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking behind these works?
Yes, so I have a show on at the moment in London at Stephen Friedman Gallery, and the entire show is actually based on Picasso's collection of African masks, African artifacts in Paris in the 1920s. Picasso was first shown an African mask by Matisse. So Matisse introduced Picasso to African art at the house of Gertrude Stein. That's where he first encountered African art. And then subsequently, Picasso went to the Trocadero, which was a museum of African art, and he was obsessed by the spiritual power of those objects, and he collected several objects, at least close to 100 African objects and artifacts. And I was surprised when I went through his archive and discovered them. And then I made an entire show around Picasso's collection of African art. So I remade some of the objects in his collection. And then Picasso was very much interested in metamorphosis. He was interested in man-animal imagery, centaurs, and so on. So then I created these sculptures. And I also created some of the masks I painted. I don't know if you got those images. I'm here.
Yes, I'll get to them in a minute. Yeah.
Yes. So this is a room that I created with some of those masks in Picasso's collection painted, but then there's a slide projection showing the fashion for African art in Paris in the 20s. So there are images of people like James Baldwin, Josephine Baker, and then artists who were influenced by African art. Modernism itself, the whole idea of Western modernism was created, when Picasso encountered African art objects. So he did that famous painting, The Ladies of Avignon. And that was a revolution in modern art, because prior to that, European art was very traditional, very old-fashioned. The bourgeoisie was still kind of running everything and was radical, and it challenged that sort of old-fashioned culture or European culture. And then, of course, the Surrealism followed, Dada followed, and African art played a major role in shifting European culture into avant-garde modernism. And so what this show is symbolizing here is showing the impact that quote unquote so-called primitive art had in modernizing European culture.
Yeah. Can I ask you, Yinka, this is such an interesting image to see from a distance, since I can't see the exhibition at the moment. I think you're using a traditional slide projector here, and you've often referred to art history and iconic works as reference points. We've just seen that throughout the talk. But here you've actually put a slideshow into the exhibition. And I just wondered if you could say what prompted you to make the link so explicit, so direct?
The link with the slideshow, what do you mean?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking that, with your other works that we've looked at, where you've referred to Henry Wallace or Fragonard and famous painters, we often sort of make that connection ourselves as viewers, whereas here you're bringing people into your exhibition and you've actually brought those historical images into your space and made it part of your installation. And I wondered what made you want to be so direct and explicit with that link.
Yeah, well, I wanted to give people context when they came to the exhibition. And also, this is linked to one of the reasons for doing this exhibition is the fact that currently, Black artists are very fashionable in the market. And everyone's talking about Black artists. Every gallery wants to have a Black artist. Now, during the Harlem Renaissance period in the late 20s, many African artists were very famous and popular and fashionable. But then after the Depression era, post-30s, many of those artists were kind of forgotten and abandoned. And so I'm raising a number of questions here. I don't have answers myself. Are we going through another kind of pre-Depression fashion for Black art? Or are we actually going to go through a period of real collecting? Because you also know that after the Black Lives Matter campaign and the really terrible incident with George Floyd, there's more empathy towards Black culture generally. But I don't want that to be a short-term thing, because we also know that the global art market, you will be shocked to know that only about possibly just a bit less than 2% is work from Black artists. So that means that the entire 98%, Black people are not participating in the billions and billions of dollars of the art market. Black people only participate in just about 2% of it.
That is an absolutely shocking statistic. Yeah.
Which then will enrich, the few Black artists who are in that market, only very few, have incredible prices in the market, which will then go to enrich not the Black community, but the white community. So, and that's the statistics at the moment. That is the situation, and people should know this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Absolutely. These are some of the images in the slideshow. I also wanted to show this installation image also to give a sense of scale and to show these quilts that you've also included in the exhibition, which, as you can see from the title here, they're studies of African art from Picasso's collection. So are these drawings that you made that were then turned into quilts, or what are we looking at here?
They're drawings that I've made, and then the drawings were stitched and made into quilts. So then they are all kind of fabrics and switched. You can see the process, and that's deliberate. So you can see threads hanging down, and which is, what I wanted the pieces to be. I wanted very much the whole kind of process of the fabrication to be visible.
Yeah, it's beautiful to have this detailed view and be able to see what's actually going on with these works. This exhibition at Stephen Friedman runs until the end of July. So those of you lucky enough to be in London, go and see it. Will it travel, Yinka? Will we be able to see these over here?
Commercial gallery show, but I know that my future exhibitions will probably include some of these works.
Yeah, we're very much looking forward to seeing them in the flesh, and I'm so excited about this new body of work that you've made. Yinka, I've stopped our slide share so that people can see us properly, and I'm now going to make sure we save the rest of this time for looking at the questions that people have asked. So let me have a quick look at the chat and let you know what our audience are wanting to know from you. I'm seeing a few questions here about process. And Dreek Zurinsky, hi Dreek, glad you could tune in, would like to ask you to comment on the process for making the ship in a bottle.
Well, I mean, if I told you, I think I would have to kill you because that's a secret.
Oh, Dreek, you don't want to do that.
No, it's illegal, so I'm not going to do that.
Okay, it's a trade secret. And I have a question from Catherine Ude about how the works that you're making, the ship in a bottle certainly has a sense of fragility built into it. And I think also the paintwork on your sculptures is so unusual and striking to see. Does your sculpture withstand the weather? Is it work that's meant to be outdoors for a long period of time?
Well, the wind sculptures can be in weather at all times because what's used on them, it's kind of similar paint that you would use on a car. So that's kind of resilient, and fiberglass, boats are made out of fiberglass.
Yeah. And
boats can be in the water for a very long time, for years and years, and they're fine.
Yeah. Maybe more resilient than marble and stone, actually.
Yeah.
I have a note here from Adejoki Tubiyele, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, sending greetings to you. And I'm going to read what was written here in the question. You've been quoted as saying that while your works resonate politically, you often prefer not to choose sides, but to allow the debate or the discourse to flow forth. Important to learning, but also somewhat detached from the lens of subject-object. Can you share with us your intentions with your 1999 work, Gay Victorians?
Well, I mean, I think that, in 1999, the world has changed a lot. The rights of many gay people were still very much compromised at that time. And still today, I mean, the debates, the issues are not sort of over. We're not there yet with gay rights. We're getting somewhere, but we're not there yet. And I wanted to highlight that. I wanted to highlight those issues. So that work, in a way, it's a kind of a tribute to gay rights. That's where that came from. But about taking sides, I think that the world is a very complex place and politics is always shifting as well. So I prefer to have many layers in the things that I do. And so it's not really about taking sides. It's about shining a torch on something, but giving the possibility for different stories. And that's why, I do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have a question, perhaps somewhat following on from that, from Laurelie Lowe, asking if you consider your work with fabric and pattern as also helping to dispel gender associations regarding the use of different materials in art.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because actually, when I started using those materials, that was regarded as craft, and it was regarded as kind of not high art. Now, of course, it's really super cool and fashionable to use pattern and design. And it was also considered not valid women's work as well. And those are the kinds of things that actually make me want to use something more if it's regarded in that way. And that's, what I was doing all those years ago. Now it's completely normal to see stitched works within high art museums and galleries. But that was not the case when I started work, in the late 80s, early 90s.
That's so true. Yeah, absolutely. There are a few questions here about your Dutch wax fabrics. And Dreek wants to know, how did it start? Can you recall the moment when you began using that fabric?
Yes, I mean, that's something I've talked about quite a lot. I was at college at the time, and I'd been doing painting from the nude because that was my training, just life drawing and painting from the nude. But then my political consciousness, I was only a young kid at the time, but my political consciousness was starting to come forward. And I couldn't understand, why did we have to be drawing all these passive women as a way to practice drawing from the figure? And so I became really political. And then I started making work about what was going on in Russia at the time, which was perestroika. Russia was changing over. The Cold War was starting to slowly ebb away. And then my tutor said, well, you're of African origin, aren't you? Why aren't you producing authentic African art? And I figured I was a world citizen and I could make work about anything I wanted to. But then the question didn't leave my head. I thought, what did this person mean by authentic African art? I grew up in Lagos, I grew up in London, so I could move easily between all these spheres. And so, and I saw that, if I wanted to make work about Russia, why not? But nevertheless, the question didn't go away. So, and then in search of this so-called authenticity, or the fabrication of authenticity, I went to a market in London, in Brixton. And then, I saw the fabrics in the shop, and I grew up thinking the fabrics were authentically African. And then I decided then to ask about those fabrics. And then they said, well, the fabrics are Indonesian inspired fabrics produced by the Dutch and then sold back into the African market. And the fabrics are also made in Africa and China now. But I was very interested in the fabrics and those global trade routes and the metaphor then for the life of a contemporary African who can move between different global spheres. And so that's the short answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thank you. And following on from that, I have a question from Indi Chowdhury asking if you could talk about how much your choice of materials impacts your form and process. Which comes first?
Well, I mean, I think that for me, form is not divorced from content. And so the two things have to work together, I think, for a work of art to be meaningful for me. So, and of course, politically, we all know why I use those fabrics, but then the form or what I'm trying to do must also carry some of the content. And so it's constantly interesting to me as to how I then try to make those two things work together.
Mm-hmm. I have another question that relates to that a little bit too, from Mariam Ohadi Hamadani, asking, could you talk about the significance of materiality in your public monuments as material and symbolically?
Well, I mean, again, we talked about history, the importance of history, but also the importance of materials and the politics of materials as well. And so it's important politically what you're doing with the materials, what the materials are, most importantly, and what they mean in relation to the thing that you're trying to say.
I have a question here from Ellen. Have you always seen your art as an exploration of history and the crossroads of controversy in society?
Well, in a way, I didn't actually find history. History kind of found me, in the sense that my life today is linked to what happened before and what happened to my people. And so I didn't choose that. So in fact, speaking English to you now, it's not my choice. Yoruba is my language and I speak Yoruba really well. But I speak English as a matter of convenience. I'd rather speak Yoruba. But it's convenient because I know that speaking English is economically viable. But if I had a choice, I would speak Yoruba to everybody. I don't want to speak English. But I'm kind of forced to speak a language that's not mine. And that's what history has done. So I have to confront it.
Yeah, well, that's a very powerful point. I'm sorry I can't speak Yoruba with you. Yeah, absolutely. There are other questions here about the way in which you use art history in your work, and people wanting to know when you really got engaged with art history. Was it when you were at college that you really dived into studying art history and becoming interested in it?
Yes, when I was at college, but also I found that actually it's important to understand my life now. I have to understand history, and then to understand the art that I see around me, I have to understand where they came from. I also have to understand my own relationship to those things. And so, in a way, it wasn't actually a matter of choice. It's a matter of, do I want to understand life or not?
Yeah, I like that sentence. It's very powerful. Well, maybe that's a good note to end on. Yinka, thank you so much for joining us, for making the time. I know this is an incredibly busy moment for you. Probably always, but especially with the Royal Academy show. I wondered whether, as we close, whether there was anything you'd like to tell us about what it's like to work on the summer show for the Royal Academy, that iconic event on the calendar.
Well, it's complex because the Royal Academy show is a very accessible exhibition. It's open to the public to submit works, and also the proceeds from that exhibition will go towards paying for the education, a postgraduate degree education at the Royal Academy, because the Royal Academy does have a school, and many people don't know that. It's a 3-year master's degree, which is also unusual, but it's completely free, which is another unusual thing. And it's the only fantastic master's degree I know that's actually completely free and paid for through sales from the summer exhibition. So it's a very, very important thing to be doing. So I feel honored to be a part of that. And then we have usually up to about 17,000 entries, of which, with my fellow academicians, we have to go through all of this. And that's what I've been doing this week. It's a tough gig, but it's a worthwhile gig.
Wow, you're looking at 17,000 entries. That's pretty incredible. Well, I wish you bon continuation with the Royal Academy show. And I had a couple of questions about your current exhibition in the chat. It's Stephen Friedman Gallery, and it's on view until the end of the month. And yeah, I envy those of you in London who can go and see it, but I'm sure we'll see some of those works on this side of the water at some point in the near future. Yinka, thank you so much for your time and for engaging with us. It's always been such a pleasure to talk with you. I'm so proud that we have 2 incredible works of yours in our collection. And I wish you all the best with the Royal Academy. And thank you for joining us for this program.
No, thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. And I'm just going to close and say goodbye to everyone by mentioning that our next online Artist in Conversation program is on Friday, June the 25th, also at 12 p.m. Eastern, with the artist filmmaker Jonna Comfra and the sound artist Trevor Matheson. And that'll be moderated by Indy Chowdhury, who's our postgraduate associate here at the Yale Center for British Art. So with that, I wish everybody farewell, and thank you again, Yinka.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.